What if the man who once ruled skyscrapers, boardrooms, and fortune itself woke up one morning unable to remember his own name, while the empire he built slipped quietly into the hands of enemies? If stories of healing, redemption, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing and staying with us until the very last chapter of this journey. Jonathan Hale used to be a name that filled the front pages of the Wall Street Journal, whispered across the corridors of power, and printed in bold on Forbes's list of America's most influential. Hale Group, the empire he built with relentless vision, had once towered over Manhattan like a fortress of glass and steel. But tonight, Jonathan was not the man on those glossy magazine covers. Tonight, he was just a hollow silhouette, sitting in the dim corner of his Upper East Side mansion, staring at the fire that would not warm him. 3 months had passed since the accident. At least, that was what the doctors had told him. They said the brakes of his car had failed on a rain-slicked road upstate. They said his wife and daughter hadn't survived. They said he was lucky to be alive. Jonathan often wondered if lucky was the cruelest word in the English language. The firelight painted his face in gold and shadow. His once sharp blue eyes seemed dull now, clouded with a fog that memory refused to clear. He had no recollection of the screams in the car, no image of the crash itself, only fragments, as though his life had been shredded into paper scraps and blown into the wind. Every time he reached for a memory, pain lanced through his skull, and darkness swallowed him whole. The mansion itself had grown silent, a museum of grief. The walls that once rang with a child's laughter now echoed only the ticking of an antique clock. The grand piano in the parlor gathered dust. The dining table remained set for 3, as though Eleanor, his mother, refused to admit that 2 seats would forever remain empty. Eleanor Hale was a woman of iron grace. Silver hair swept into a chignon, pearls at her throat. She had been the matriarch of both family and company for decades, but even iron bends under enough weight. Tonight, she stood at the foot of the grand staircase, gazing at her son. Her heart ached at the sight. Jonathan, the man who had once conquered mergers worth billions, now looked more like a ghost haunting his own estate. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned, as though startled by his own name. His lips parted. But no words came. The doctors had warned Eleanor. Recovery might be slow, or it might never come at all. Trauma, grief, and the possibility of deliberate sabotage, the combination had left Jonathan's memory fractured. And while her son wandered through fog, the company was teetering. Rival corporations circled Hale Group like vultures over a wounded animal. Shareholders whispered about leadership votes. Old allies were quietly jumping ship, but Eleanor refused to give in. Hale Group was not just a company. It was her husband's legacy, her son's lifeblood, and the name her granddaughter had once proudly carried on her backpack to school. She believed, with a ferocity only a mother could summon, that Jonathan would find his way back. Yet tonight, Jonathan barely looked alive. He lifted a glass of untouched bourbon, stared at it as though it might hold the missing pieces of his life, and then set it down again. The amber liquid trembled with the weight of silence. A storm gathered outside. Wind lashed against the mansion windows, rattling the old frames. Thunder rolled in the distance like a war drum. Jonathan's reflection in the glass looked like a stranger's face, an empire reduced to skin and bone. Eleanor approached quietly, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jonathan, you cannot stay in this shadow forever," she whispered. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he saw nothing but shards. A child's laughter, gone before he could touch it. A woman's perfume, vanishing like smoke. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the taste of blood. And then nothing. "I don't know who I am anymore," Jonathan said hoarsely, each word like gravel dragged across his throat. "You are my son," Eleanor replied firmly. "And you are the man who built Hale Group with his own hands. You are not lost. You are only waiting to remember." But Jonathan shook his head. "If I cannot remember them, then perhaps I don't deserve to." Silence fell heavy between them. The storm outside battered the house, as though nature itself was determined to test its foundation. Eleanor's hand tightened on his shoulder, but she knew words alone would not mend him. He needed something more, something she could not give. Jonathan rose slowly, walking to the grand piano in the corner of the room. Dust blanketed its polished surface. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling, uncertain. Once he had played lullabies here, his daughter's favorite before bedtime. He tried to press a key now, but the sound that emerged was broken, discordant, like a heart cracked in two. He flinched and slammed the lid shut. The echo reverberated through the empty house, and with it came the sharp stab of another headache. He pressed his temples, staggering back into the shadows. Eleanor caught him, steadying him before he collapsed. She looked at him then, not as a CEO, not as a leader, but as the boy she once carried in her arms. And for the first time in years, she prayed aloud. "God, send us a light in this darkness, even the smallest flame. Please." Unseen beyond the storm, that prayer was already beginning to take shape, in the footsteps of a woman named Margaret, and the voice of her little girl, Clara, who would soon walk through these doors and ignite a spark no empire could. But tonight, Jonathan Hale remained in his prison of silence, unaware that his story was only beginning again. Snow still clung to the eaves of the Hale mansion like frostbitten lace, though the storm had passed. In the pale light of dawn, the grand estate stood on Fifth Avenue with its high iron gates, stone lions at the entrance, and windows shuttered against the world. To strangers, it still looked like a fortress of wealth. But for those within, it was a mausoleum, grand yet hollow, echoing with silence. That silence was broken the morning Margaret Ashford stepped out of a yellow cab, clutching her daughter's hand. Clara, 10 years old, blinked wide-eyed at the towering mansion. She had been here once before when she was only 5, but memory at that age was patchy. All she recalled was the kindness of Mrs. Eleanor's smile and the sweet scent of roses in the back garden. Now the roses were gone, the garden stripped bare by winter. Clara's small fingers tightened around her mother's hand. "Is this really where we'll be living, Mama?" she whispered. Margaret offered her a reassuring nod. She was a woman in her 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined not by vanity but by years of honest labor. Once she had been head housekeeper for the Hales, trusted with their most intimate domestic rhythms. Birthdays, holiday dinners, even the quiet mornings when little Sophie Hale had needed a mother's touch while her own parents rushed to board meetings. Margaret had left when her husband fell ill, taking lesser-paying work closer to home so she could nurse him until his final breath. After his passing, she struggled, working night shifts to keep food on the table for Clara. When Eleanor's call came weeks ago, it felt less like a job offer and more like providence. "Don't be afraid," Margaret murmured to her daughter as the cab pulled away. "The Hales have always been good to us. And maybe we can be good for them, too." Clara looked up at the mansion again, her imagination teeming. To her, it was less a house than a castle, filled with locked rooms and secret corridors. She wondered what sort of king lived here now. The butler opened the door before they could knock. His expression was stiff, polite, but weary, as though the house itself had drained warmth even from its staff. He led them inside, where Eleanor Hale waited at the foot of the staircase. "Margaret," Eleanor said with a sigh that was equal parts relief and sorrow. Thank you for coming. The two women embraced like old friends, though grief weighed on their shoulders. Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at Clara. And this must be Clara. My, how you've grown. Clara dipped her head shyly. Good morning, ma'am. No need for ma'am, child. You may call me Mrs. Hale, or better yet, Grandmother Eleanor, if you like. The words startled Clara, but they carried no pretense. Eleanor's gaze was warm, almost hungry, as though she longed for the presence of a grandchild again. Clara gave a small smile, but it faded as soon as she glanced toward the darkened hallway where she sensed another figure lurking unseen. Jonathan Hale appeared at the landing above, dressed in a plain gray sweater and black trousers. He looked nothing like the powerful man splashed across magazine covers. No tailored suits, no gleaming cufflinks. His hair was unkempt, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow as storm cloud glass. Clara froze. The weight of his presence pressed on her chest. He was tall, yes, and strong once, but he seemed more like a statue that had cracked under time and weather. Jonathan, Eleanor said gently, do you remember Margaret? Jonathan's gaze shifted slowly, like an old record turning. His eyes landed on Margaret, narrowing as though riffling through dust-clogged memory. After a long pause, he gave a faint nod. You worked here before, he murmured. His voice was gravel, low and detached. Yes, sir, Margaret replied softly. Many years. And this is your daughter? Yes, Clara. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the child. Clara stared back, both curious and intimidated. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, a spark, faint and trembling, like a match struck in the dark. But then it vanished, replaced by the blankness of a man who lived half in shadow. Without another word, Jonathan turned and disappeared into the corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. Clara exhaled only after he was gone. He's scary, she whispered to her mother. Margaret bent down to meet her daughter's gaze. Not scary, my love. Just broken. That night, Clara explored her new room. It was modest compared to the rest of the mansion, with pale wallpaper and a small window overlooking the garden. She lay awake listening to the house creak. Somewhere down the corridor, she heard Jonathan pacing, restless in his insomnia. The next morning, Clara wandered into the library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned with books, their spines glinting in the dim light. She pulled down a fairy tale volume and curled into an armchair, but soon her eyes drifted to the corner where Jonathan sat in silence. He did not notice her at first, or perhaps he pretended not to. His fingers toyed with a leather-bound journal whose pages remained blank. Clara, with a child's blunt honesty, broke the silence. Why don't you write something in it? Jonathan blinked, as though the question had pierced a wall. Because I don't know what to write, he said flatly. Then maybe just a word, Clara suggested. Any word, like sun or hope. That way the book won't be empty. Jonathan stared at her. He did not smile, but his jaw loosened slightly. He closed the journal and set it aside. Without another word, he left the library. Clara hugged the fairy tale book to her chest, sensing something important had just shifted, however small. Later that evening, Eleanor confided to Margaret in the kitchen. He doesn't talk. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't live, Margaret. I don't know how to reach him. Margaret glanced toward the parlor, where Clara was humming to herself. Sometimes, she said gently, children reach where adults cannot. Eleanor followed her gaze. Hope stirred within her like an ember refusing to die. That ember would soon flare into a flame, carried on the innocent voice of a little girl who had no idea she was stepping into a man's broken memory. The third morning in the Hale mansion dawned cold and gray. Light filtered through tall curtains like smoke, pale and uncertain. Clara wandered the long corridors, her footsteps echoing across marble floors that seemed too vast for a child's presence. She carried a book tucked beneath her arm, but it was not words she sought that day. It was sound. Her small fingers trailed along the wall until they found the door to the parlor. She pushed it open, and there it was, the grand piano, silent and dust-covered, its black lacquer dulled by neglect. Clara tiptoed closer. Her mother had told her not to pry, that some doors in this house carried ghosts. But curiosity and a child's instinct drew her in. She lifted the heavy lid, wincing at its creak. The keys were ivory, worn by years of touch. She pressed one tentatively. A single note bloomed into the empty air, trembling like a bird startled from its nest. Clara smiled. She pressed another, then another, fumbling into a hesitant pattern. And then it came to her, the lullaby her mother had once sung to her on nights of fear. Margaret had told her it was an old tune, simple yet enduring, and had mentioned once, in passing, that Mrs. Eleanor's granddaughter had loved the very same song. Clara, not knowing how deep those notes would cut, began to play. The melody was uneven at first, her small hands uncertain. But as she found the rhythm, her voice joined softly, humming words half-remembered. Upstairs, Jonathan Hale stirred. He had been pacing the length of his room, restless as always, unable to summon peace even in exhaustion. The sound stopped him mid-step. Notes drifted upward through the floorboards, winding their way into the fortress of his mind. At first he thought it a hallucination. For weeks sounds had taunted him. Phantom echoes of laughter, fleeting cries that dissolved into silence. But this was different. This was not a trick of grief. This was music, real and fragile, carrying a memory he had locked away. His chest tightened. His knees nearly buckled as flashes pierced the fog. A little girl, hair the color of honey, perched on the piano bench beside him. Her hands striking the keys, missing notes, laughing as he corrected her. A woman's voice singing along, her perfume like jasmine in summer air. Sophie. Anna. Jonathan gripped the wall, gasping as the names seared through him like lightning. For the first time since the accident, the memory was not a blurred photograph but a living image. So vivid it stole his breath. Driven by instinct, he stumbled down the stairs, following the sound. Each step pounded like a drumbeat against his temples. The parlor door was ajar. He pushed it wider, and there, bathed in morning light, sat Clara at the piano. Her small back was straight, her head bent with concentration, her fingers chasing the lullaby as though she were tracing stars. Jonathan's heart froze. For one delirious moment, he thought his Sophie had returned. His eyes burned. The world spun. "Stop!" he croaked, his voice harsh with panic. Clara jumped, her hands slipping off the keys. The melody died with a clatter of broken notes. She turned, wide-eyed, face pale. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean—" Jonathan staggered into the room. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the piano. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. Clara shrank back. "My mama taught me. It's just a song. I didn't know." The sight of her frightened face pierced him. For a moment, anger dissolved into anguish. Jonathan pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to cage the storm within. "I shouldn't have played," Clara whispered. "I'll stop." "No." The word escaped him before he realized. He dropped his hands and stared at her. His voice softened, ragged with confusion. "Don't stop." Clara tilted her head, uncertain. Jonathan sank into the chair beside the piano, his shoulders heaving. He felt as though he were split in two, the man he once was, and the shell he had become. "That song," he said hoarsely. "My daughter. She used to play it." Clara's lips parted, her young heart swelling with both sorrow and awe. She wanted to say something, anything, but all she could manage was, "I didn't know." Jonathan studied her face. In her wide brown eyes he saw echoes of another child, though he knew it was an illusion. And yet the innocence in her gaze anchored him to the present. For the first time he did not feel utterly alone. Eleanor entered then, her footsteps brisk. She froze when she saw them, her son seated by the piano, Clara beside him, the ghost of music lingering in the air. For a heartbeat, hope bloomed in her chest. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "are you all right?" He nodded faintly, though tears streaked his cheeks. "I remembered," he whispered, almost in disbelief. "I saw them. For a moment. I saw them." Eleanor's throat tightened. She moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That is the beginning," she murmured. Clara watched silently, her hands still resting on the ivory keys. She felt like she had opened a locked door without meaning to. The air in the room pulsed with something fragile, something sacred. Jonathan turned to her. His expression was raw, unguarded. "Play it again," he asked quietly. Clara hesitated. If it doesn't hurt you." "It hurts," Jonathan admitted. "But it also reminds me I am alive." So she played, slowly, gently, until the room filled once more with the lullaby. Jonathan closed his eyes. The images came again, his daughter's giggle, his wife's hand on his shoulder. But this time, though grief stabbed at him, it did not hollow him out. Instead, it stitched something back together. When the last note faded, silence settled. But it was no longer the suffocating silence of loss. It was a silence alive with memory, fragile yet real. Jonathan looked at Clara, and for the first time since the accident, his lips curved, not fully, not freely, but enough to be called a smile. Clara's heart soared at the sight, and Eleanor, standing by the doorway, pressed her hand to her chest. For the first time, she dared to believe her son might yet return to her. Not just as a man, but as a father figure. Perhaps not to his own child anymore, but to the little girl who had just lit the darkness. The Hale mansion had always been proud of its silence. Vaulted ceilings, swallowing echoes, marble floors polished to a mirror, the tick of the grandfather clock punctuating the emptiness like a metronome. But silence that once symbolized wealth had soured into something darker. The silence of absence, of lives torn away. It was Clara who first broke it. That afternoon, Jonathan found her sitting cross-legged on the library rug, a stack of books around her like a fortress. She was reading aloud, her voice soft but certain, filling the dusty chamber with life. At first, Jonathan thought she was reading for herself, but as he lingered by the doorway, he realized she was reading for him. "And the knight searched the dark forest for 7 days," Clara recited, "but he never stopped, because he believed even the smallest light could lead him home." Jonathan's throat tightened. For weeks he had let the silence drown him, convinced no voice could reach him again. Yet here was a child weaving words into the cracks of his grief. "Why read out loud?" he asked suddenly. His voice startled even himself, rough from disuse. Clara looked up, eyes wide, then softened into a smile. "Because stories sound different when someone hears them. They make rooms feel less lonely." Her answer slipped past Jonathan's defenses. He lowered himself into the armchair across from her, still wary but unwilling to retreat. "Go on," he murmured. She nodded eagerly and turned a page. For the next hour, her voice meandered through the tales of wandering knights and lost queens, her cadence rising and falling with childish sincerity. Jonathan closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The fog in his mind did not lift, but something inside shifted. An ember, faint but real. When she finished, she set the book aside. "Do you want to know what happens next?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Clara beamed. It was the first time she had seen him ask for anything. The following day, Clara found the old piano in the parlor. She pressed a few hesitant keys, the notes trembling into the air like forgotten prayers. Jonathan, drawn by the sound, appeared in the doorway. He expected her to stop in fright, but Clara kept playing, awkward and halting, until the melody of a lullaby emerged. It was the same one that had pierced his memory before. His chest constricted, but instead of fleeing, he listened. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling. "Like this," he whispered, guiding her through the pattern. The music faltered, then steadied, two pairs of hands weaving notes together. For a moment, the mansion no longer felt like a tomb, but a place where voices and music might live again. When the last note faded, Clara glanced up shyly. "You're good at listening," she said. "My friends' dads never listen like that." Jonathan froze. A strange ache swelled in him, pain and warmth tangled. He managed the barest of smiles. That evening, as they lingered in the sitting room, Clara began to talk not of fairy tales but of her own past. Her words carried no self-pity, only the candor of a child who had seen much and accepted it. "We used to live in a little town in West Virginia," she said, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Mama worked nights at the diner. I used to wait with my homework in the back booth until she finished. Sometimes the miners would come in covered in dust and give me peppermint candies. They didn't have much, but they were kind." Jonathan listened, surprised. He had never considered the landscape of her world: coal towns, worn faces, kindness carved out of hardship. Clara went on, her voice hushed as though the memory itself were fragile. "In winter the garden was bare, but one farmer always brought us turnips and carrots from his field, even when his own family barely had enough. Mama cried once when he left them on our porch. She said poor people often give the most." Jonathan closed his eyes. Images of Fifth Avenue boardrooms clashed with visions of those miners and farmers. His own wealth suddenly felt gaudy, irrelevant. Here was a girl shaped not by privilege but by resilience, and yet she carried more light than anyone he knew. He whispered almost to himself, "Poor people often give the most." Clara nodded solemnly. "That's why I wanted to read to you. Sometimes little things help, even when you think they don't." Jonathan's chest ached. He thought of Anna, of Sophie, of the life he had lost. He thought of the empire crumbling outside these walls, but when he looked at Clara, he felt something he hadn't dared in months: hope. Later, Eleanor entered quietly. She froze at the sight before her. Jonathan in the armchair, not slumped in despair, but leaning forward, eyes alive as he listened to Clara recount her small-town memories. For the first time since the accident, her son looked less like a ghost. Eleanor's throat tightened. She did not interrupt. She simply watched, hands clasped, tears pricking her eyes. When Clara finally yawned and curled into her chair, Jonathan rose and placed a blanket over her. He lingered, studying her small, sleeping form. His heart clenched with both sorrow and something startlingly tender. Eleanor stepped forward then, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "You're changing," she whispered. Jonathan did not look away from the child. "No," he murmured. "She's changing me." And for the first time since the brakes failed on that rain-slicked road, Jonathan Hale felt the faint warmth of a future. The following week, the mansion awoke with a new rhythm. Not loud, not vibrant, but different. Jonathan Hale no longer spent his days cloistered in the shadows of his room. He drifted toward the library, toward the parlor where the piano now bore fingerprints instead of dust, toward the sound of Clara's voice as she read. Yet with each step forward came the weight of memory pressing back. One gray afternoon, Jonathan sat at his desk in the library, a thick folder of reports before him. They were documents Margaret had carefully stacked at Eleanor's request: financial forecasts, shareholder letters, pending contracts. Hale Group was bleeding. Stocks had dipped again. Whispers of an acquisition by rivals grew louder. Jonathan opened the file, the pages sharp under his fingertips. He forced himself to read. At first, the numbers were familiar: assets, liabilities, quarterly projections. He could almost feel his old self returning, the man who once ruled these figures like a general commanding an army. But then the lines blurred, numbers swam. His temples throbbed. Pain surged like a blade through his skull. He slammed the folder shut and staggered back. "Mr. Hale?" Clara's small voice broke the silence. She had been curled in an armchair nearby, sketching flowers in a notebook. She hurried to his side. Jonathan waved her off weakly. "It's nothing, just my head." Clara tilted her head. "Mama says when a puzzle makes your head hurt, you have to start with one small piece, not the whole thing at once." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't a child's puzzle, Clara. This is an empire crumbling." "But puzzles are puzzles," she replied with the blunt wisdom only children carry. She picked up the folder, flipping to the middle. "See this number here? Maybe just start with this one, then the next, like putting edges together first." Jonathan stared at her. For years, the greatest minds on Wall Street had hung on his every strategy. Now, a 10-year-old girl was teaching him how to breathe through a crisis. He exhaled slowly and nodded. "Perhaps you're right." She smiled, returning the folder. "Even big castles get built one brick at a time." That evening, Jonathan wandered down the portrait hallway. The air smelled faintly of polish and dust. The faces of his ancestors stared back at him, solemn and proud. But it was the portrait at the end that froze him. Anna, painted in soft oils, holding Sophie in her lap. His wife's golden hair cascaded over her shoulders. His daughter's eyes sparkled with mischief. Jonathan's knees nearly buckled. He reached out, fingertips trembling just shy of the canvas. The memory struck with brutal clarity. Sophie giggling as she tried to braid her mother's hair, Anna's gentle scolding, his own laughter echoing through the parlor. The sound of light footsteps broke his trance. Clara appeared at his side, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She followed his gaze to the portrait. "She looks a little like me," Clara whispered. "Her smile. Not her hair, though." Jonathan swallowed hard. His instinct was to correct her, to guard Sophie's memory jealously. But then he saw the earnestness in Clara's eyes. She wasn't trying to replace. She was reaching across time. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "She did smile like you." Clara's face lit up, then faltered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you sad." Jonathan crouched, his voice raw. "You didn't make me sad. You reminded me she was real." For the first time since the accident, he said Sophie's name aloud. Clara repeated it softly, as though carrying it carefully in her hands. Eleanor, watching unseen from the far end of the corridor, pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision. Her son was not only remembering, he was allowing the memories to live again. The next morning, Jonathan returned to the piano. Clara was already there, plinking out a halting version of the lullaby. He sat beside her. His hands shook as they hovered over the keys. "Do you want me to play?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. Today I will try." The first notes stumbled, discordant. His jaw clenched. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Clara whispered, steady and sure. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be yours." Jonathan froze. The words sank into him like balm on a wound. He tried again, slower this time, and though the melody faltered, it carried a fragile truth. By the final chord his chest ached, but with something more than grief. Clara grinned. "See? You're like my papa would have been." The words struck him like lightning. "Your papa?" Clara nodded. "I don't remember him much. Mama says he was kind. When you listen, I think maybe he was like that." Jonathan's throat closed. In her words, he heard both longing and trust. He had lost his own daughter, but perhaps, in some strange twist of fate, he had been given another chance to be a father. That night, Jonathan sat at his desk with a blank journal before him. For months, it had remained empty, mocking his inability to write. Now, with trembling hand, he wrote a single word across the page. Hope. When Eleanor peeked in later, she saw him bent over the book. She did not intrude. She only smiled, whispering to herself, "He's finding his way back." The mansion had grown quieter that week, but not in the way of grief. It was the hush of a household holding its breath, waiting for something unnamed. Jonathan spent more hours in the library now, his pen scratching across ledgers, the word hope still visible on the first page of his journal. Eleanor, seeing the faint fire in his eyes, allowed herself to dream again. Margaret moved through the halls with steadier steps, and Clara, small, restless Clara, watched everything. Her ears sharper than anyone realized. It was she who stumbled upon the secret. One evening, after supper, Clara padded toward the kitchen, hoping Margaret had tucked away an extra cookie. The house was dim, lit only by wall sconces casting long shadows across the corridor. She rounded the corner and froze. Mr. Preston, one of Jonathan's senior directors, stood near the pantry. His back was turned, his voice low and clipped into a phone. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her breath caught in her throat. "Yes, he's improving," Preston muttered. "But don't worry. Hale will never take back the reins. The board is nearly ready to vote. By next quarter, the company will be in your hands." Clara's heart thumped. She peeked carefully. His face glowed in the screen's light, sharp and cold. "The accident should have finished him," Preston hissed. "If he regains too much, we'll need another push. Yes, I'll handle it." Clara gasped. The sound was small, but it was enough. Preston stiffened, head snapping toward the door. Clara darted behind the counter, pressing her palms over her mouth. The silence stretched. She prayed he hadn't seen her. Then, at last, Preston ended the call and strode away, his shoes striking hard against the marble. Only when the echoes faded did Clara exhale. Her body trembled. She wanted to run to her mother, but some instinct told her this was bigger than anything she could carry alone. That night, she couldn't sleep. She twisted in her bed, the words repeating in her mind. The accident should have finished him. She clutched her pillow, torn between fear and duty. If she said nothing, Jonathan might be hurt again. But if she spoke, would anyone believe a child? At dawn, she made her choice. She found Jonathan in the library, his hair tousled, papers spread before him. He looked up at her, startled by her urgency. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, "I think someone's trying to hurt you." He set his pen down slowly. "What do you mean?" Her voice shook. "I heard Mr. Preston last night. On the phone. He said the accident should have finished you, and that he won't let you take the company back." The words hit Jonathan like a thunderclap. His skin went pale, his breath shallow. For months, his memories had been fractured, cruel flashes of glass and screams. But now, Clara's trembling confession unlocked the storm. Headlights glaring in the rearview mirror, the steering wheel jerking beneath his grip. Brakes failing with terrifying silence. Anna's voice crying his name. Sophie's hand clawing at his sleeve, the spin, the shatter, the plunge into darkness. Jonathan staggered back, clutching the desk. His vision swam. He had believed he was cursed by chance, abandoned by fate. But this was no accident. It had been engineered. Murder disguised as misfortune. "Sir?" Clara asked, her eyes wide with fear. Jonathan gripped the desk until his knuckles whitened. His jaw clenched, but his voice was steady. "You did the bravest thing you could have, Clara. You told me the truth. You may have saved my life." Clara blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "I didn't want to, but I couldn't let them hurt you again." Jonathan lowered himself to her height, his hands trembling as they rested on her shoulders. "Listen to me. You are never to blame for what you hear, and because you spoke, I can finally see clearly." Eleanor entered then, drawn by the raised voices. Her gaze darted between them. "What's happening?" Jonathan looked up at her, his face hard with revelation. "Mother, it wasn't an accident. Preston, he and the competitors, they cut the brakes. They murdered Anna and Sophie, and they nearly killed me." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth. She swayed, gripping the doorframe. For months, suspicion had gnawed at her, but suspicion was nothing compared to this truth. Tears welled, but fury burned hotter beneath them. "No more hiding," Jonathan said, rising to his full height. His voice shook with grief, but was steeled by resolve. "They took my family. Now they want the company. They think I'll crawl back into the dark." "But I won't." Eleanor straightened, her spine regal, her eyes fierce. "Then you won't face them alone." That evening, Jonathan summoned Eleanor and Margaret to the study. The heavy oak desk was covered with contracts, financial reports, and notes hastily scrawled in his journal. Clara sat in the corner, hugging her knees, but listening with every fiber of her being. "We need evidence," Jonathan said. "Proof of Preston's betrayal and his ties to the rival group." Clara overheard him, but they'll dismiss her testimony unless we can back it up. "We need documents, transfers, witnesses." Eleanor nodded. "I still have allies on the board, men and women who remain loyal to our family. If we can present them the truth, we can cut out the rot." Margaret, steady as always, laid a hand on Jonathan's arm. "You have more strength than you know. You came back from the brink of death. You will come back from this too." Jonathan looked at the three of them, his mother, his old friend, and the child who had brought light to his ruins. He realized he was no longer fighting just for Hale Group. He was fighting for them, for the fragile family that had taken root in his home. Later, when the house had quieted, Clara tiptoed into the parlor. Jonathan was there, staring at the piano, his face taut with resolve. She slipped her hand into his. "Are you scared?" she asked. Jonathan did not lie. "Yes, but fear no longer owns me. I'll use it to fight." Clara squeezed his hand. "Then I'll remind you when it gets too hard." Jonathan pulled her into an embrace. For the first time since the crash, his voice carried the steel of his former self. "I swear to you, Clara, I will not let them take anything more from us." The shadows had whispered their plot, but Jonathan Hale had awakened, and with the courage of a child beside him, he was ready to step back into the fire. The morning sun over Manhattan was merciless, sharp as glass against the skyline. For months, Jonathan Hale had avoided the city's towers, the very empire he had built from sweat and will. But today, as he stood before the mirror in his bedroom adjusting the lapels of a navy suit, the reflection staring back at him no longer looked like a hollow ghost. The man in the mirror bore scars, yes, grief carved into his eyes, loss etched into his shoulders, but there was steel there again. Margaret appeared at the door. Her voice was soft but reverent. "It suits you, sir. Like armor." Jonathan gave a faint smile. "Armor is exactly what I need." Downstairs, Eleanor waited in the foyer with Clara. The child's eyes widened when she saw him. "You look like a superhero," she whispered. Jonathan crouched until his eyes met hers. "Not a superhero, Clara. Just a man trying to do what's right." Clara grinned. "That's even better." Together, the three generations walked to the waiting car. The ride to Hale Group headquarters was silent, charged with the hum of anticipation. Clara held Jonathan's hand the entire way, her small palm steady in his grasp. Hale Tower loomed over Park Avenue, a fortress of glass and steel. For weeks, the press had speculated that Jonathan Hale was finished, a broken man incapable of leading. Inside, whispers spread like wildfire. Preston was maneuvering for control, ready to hand the company to rivals. But this morning, Jonathan walked through the lobby with his mother on one side and Clara on the other. The marble floor reflected his stride. Employees froze, staring in disbelief. Murmurs rose. "He's back. Jonathan Hale is here." The board meeting was already underway when he entered. 12 directors sat around a gleaming mahogany table. Preston, seated at the head in Jonathan's absence, looked up sharply. For a heartbeat, his composure faltered, but he quickly recovered, lips curving into a practiced smile. "Well, well," Preston drawled. "Jonathan, I didn't expect you today." Jonathan's voice was steady, measured. "Clearly, but I'm here, and I have something to say before you sign away what doesn't belong to you." He strode to the head of the table where Preston had sat like a usurper and placed a thick folder of documents on the polished wood. His hands did not shake. Clara sat quietly in the back of the room beside Eleanor, her small presence unnoticed by most, but vital to Jonathan's courage. "These are contracts, financial records, and internal communications," Jonathan began. "Proof that Preston has colluded with our competitors. Proof that the so-called accident that killed my wife and daughter was sabotage." Gasps rippled through the room. Directors exchanged alarmed glances. Preston leaned back, feigning calm. "Gentlemen, ladies, you can't take this seriously. Hale's been unstable since the crash. He suffers memory loss. He's desperate, hallucinating conspiracies. Are we truly going to trust the ravings of a broken man?" Jonathan did not flinch. "Yes, I was broken. But I remember now, and I am not alone." He turned subtly toward Clara. The girl rose her voice small but unwavering. "I heard him," she said, pointing at Preston. "I heard him on the phone. He said the accident should have finished Mr. Hale. He said he'd stop him from taking the company back." The room erupted in shock. Some directors shouted in outrage, others stared at Preston in horror. Preston's mask slipped, sweat beading at his temple. "You'd take the word of a child?" he sneered. "Yes," Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos. She rose from her chair, regal and unyielding. "Because that child speaks truth with more courage than you've shown in your entire career." Jonathan straightened. "You wanted proof. You have it here, in documents, in testimony, and in the very fact that Preston has fought harder to bury me than to lead this company. The choice is yours. Follow a traitor, or stand with me." Silence fell heavy. For a moment, no one moved. Then the eldest director, a man who had served under Jonathan's father, cleared his throat. "Jonathan Hale, you have my support." Another followed, then another. Within moments, the tide shifted. The majority turned against Preston, their voices uniting in agreement. Preston's face drained of color. He gathered his papers with shaking hands. "This isn't over," he spat. "The press will eat you alive. Investors will abandon you. You can't win." Jonathan held his gaze, calm and resolute. "You already lost. The truth will finish what you started." Preston stormed out, the echo of his footsteps a retreat. The meeting adjourned with a unanimous vote to reinstate Jonathan as CEO. He stood at the head of the table, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of leadership settle back onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a calling. As the directors filed out, Jonathan turned to where Clara sat. She smiled shyly, pride shining in her eyes. He crossed the room and knelt before her. "You were braver than anyone in that room. You gave me back my voice." Clara hugged him fiercely. "Then don't lose it again." Eleanor approached, her eyes wet. "You've done what your father would have been proud of. But more than that, you've done what Anna and Sophie would have prayed for." Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice rough. "They're gone, Mother. But because of Clara, I feel them here. And I will not fail her the way I once failed myself." That afternoon, Jonathan stood in his office on the top floor of Hale Tower. The skyline stretched endlessly before him. He had feared he would never face it again. Now, the glass and steel no longer mocked him. They reflected his resolve. Clara wandered in, climbing onto the leather chair opposite his desk. "So, are you the boss again?" she asked. Jonathan chuckled softly. "Yes, but this time, I intend to lead differently. Not with pride, with purpose." "What's purpose?" Clara tilted her head. Jonathan smiled faintly. "It's when you remember why you're fighting in the first place." He looked at her. "And for me, it's you." Clara's cheeks flushed. "That means I'm important." Jonathan's voice softened. "You're the most important." As the afternoon sun poured through the windows, Jonathan Hale knew the battle was far from over. The press would come, rivals would strike, shadows would whisper. But he was no longer alone. He had his mother, his housekeeper, and a child who had become the heart of his redemption. And together, they would face the storm. The morning newspapers screamed in bold headlines. Amnesiac CEO back at the helm, but for how long? Boardroom revolt or redemption? Child witness at center of Hale Group scandal. Each line was a blade. Preston had wasted no time striking back. He flooded the media with whispers of Jonathan's instability, his hallucinations, his dependence on a servant's child. By breakfast, television anchors dissected his mental health as if it were a market trend. Investors panicked. Stocks dipped again. At the dining table, Eleanor spread the newspapers with trembling hands. "They're calling you unfit, Jonathan. They're trying to bury you in the court of opinion before the trial even begins." Jonathan's eyes were calm as he set down his coffee. "Then we'll let the real court speak louder." Clara's brow furrowed. "But why are they lying if they know the truth?" Jonathan turned to her gently. "Because the truth frightens them. And frightened men will say anything to protect themselves. That's why we must not be afraid." Within days, Jonathan's legal team filed suit against Preston and the rival conglomerate, charges of conspiracy, corporate sabotage, and attempted murder. Manhattan buzzed with anticipation. Courtroom seats filled with journalists, and the courthouse steps swarmed with cameras. On the first day of trial, Jonathan walked through the crowd with Eleanor and Margaret beside him. Clara held his hand tightly, her small figure dwarfed by the sea of microphones. Reporters shouted, "Mr. Hale, are you stable enough to testify?" "Is it true you rely on a 10-year-old for your memory?" "Clara, were you coached to accuse Mr. Preston?" Jonathan ignored them all, shielding Clara with his arm. His silence was not weakness, it was composure. Inside the courtroom, Preston sat at the defense table, his once polished arrogance now sharpened into cruelty. His lawyers painted Jonathan as a grieving widower, grasping at conspiracy theories, a man whose trauma had fractured his mind. They argued that Clara was manipulated, her testimony unreliable. Jonathan rose to speak. His voice carried the weight of months in the dark. "I lost my wife and daughter to what I believed was chance. But the truth is, I was targeted. My family was murdered. And my company nearly stolen. I stand here not only for Hale Group, but for Anna and Sophie, for justice." His voice cracked on their names, but he did not waver. The turning point came when Clara herself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as the little girl climbed into the witness chair, her feet dangling above the floor. The judge leaned forward kindly. "Do you understand why you're here, child?" Clara nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. To tell the truth." Preston's lawyer smiled coldly. "Clara, you claim you overheard my client say something about an accident. Isn't it possible you misunderstood? Adults talk in complicated ways." Clara's voice was steady. "I know what I heard. He said, 'The accident should have finished him.' Those were his exact words." The lawyer arched a brow. "But children imagine things, don't they? Fairy tales? Monsters under the bed?" Clara straightened, her eyes fierce. "Fairy tales don't kill families. Monsters do. And I heard one with my own ears." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Eleanor wept quietly. Jonathan clenched his fists beneath the table, pride surging through him. The lawyer faltered, shifting papers. "No further questions." When Clara stepped down, Jonathan knelt to hug her. "You were braver than anyone here," he whispered. Day after day, evidence mounted. Emails surfaced linking Preston to rival executives. Financial records showed secret transfers. Finally, a mechanic confessed under oath that he had been paid to tamper with Jonathan's brakes. The conspiracy unraveled thread by thread until Preston's defense was nothing more than dust. On the last day, Preston tried one final act of theater. He rose to address the jury, his voice sharp with desperation. "This is a witch hunt. Hale is manipulating sympathy. He hides behind a child because he's too broken to lead. You can't trust him. He's unstable." Jonathan rose too, his voice firm as stone. "Yes, I was broken, but I am not unstable. I am a man who lost everything to greed, and I will not let liars decide what truth is. You see before you a father who remembers the screams of his wife and child, not hallucinations but memories carved in blood. And I will not rest until justice is done." His words echoed through the chamber. Even the judge sat in silence for a long moment. The jury deliberated only 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice rang out. "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Preston slumped in his chair as bailiffs closed in. Eleanor grasped Jonathan's hand, tears streaming down her face. Margaret held Clara tightly, whispering that it was over. But Jonathan stood still, his face pale. Victory did not erase loss. The verdict would never bring back Anna or Sophie. Yet in the midst of the chaos, he felt a small tug at his sleeve. Clara looked up at him, eyes bright with relief. You did it, she whispered. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice breaking. No, Clara. We did it. Outside, the courthouse steps were a storm of cameras. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs flared, but the photograph that made front pages the next morning was not of Preston in handcuffs. It was of Jonathan Hale, standing tall, his arm around a little girl who had given him back his voice. The headlines read differently now. Jonathan Hale, from broken man to relentless fighter. Child's testimony brings down corporate giant. A CEO's redemption written in truth. The storm of lies had been drowned out by the voice of a child. The news of Preston's conviction spread like wildfire. Within a week, the front pages that once questioned Jonathan Hale's sanity now hailed him as a man of resilience. Hale Group's stock steadied. Board members, once wary, began to stand behind him again. For the outside world, the story was one of corporate redemption. But for Jonathan, the truer story was unfolding not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the quiet corners of his home. One evening, as autumn leaves swept across Fifth Avenue, Jonathan sat with Eleanor and Margaret in the parlor. Clara dozed on the rug by the fire, her kitten curled against her chest. The flames reflected in Jonathan's eyes as he spoke, his voice firm yet tender. I spent months thinking I was nothing but a shadow, he said. But I see now, I wasn't meant to stay broken. Clara gave me back my life, and now I must give something back. Eleanor leaned forward. What do you mean? Jonathan glanced at Clara's sleeping form. I want to be more than just her guardian in this house. I want to be her father, not in name alone, but in truth. Margaret's breath caught. For years, she had carried the burden of raising Clara alone, her daughter fatherless. Tears filled her eyes. Are you certain, sir? That's a promise for life. Jonathan nodded, resolute. Yes, she deserves nothing less. The following week, Jonathan asked Margaret if he could see where she and Clara had lived before Eleanor called them back to New York. Margaret hesitated, but eventually agreed. They drove for hours out of the city, past manicured suburbs and into the winding roads of West Virginia's coal country. The landscape grew harsher. Abandoned gas stations, shuttered diners, rusted trucks on front lawns. Hills rose on either side, their trees nearly bare, the towns nestled between them small and weary. This is where we were, Margaret said quietly, her voice tinged with memory. Clara pressed her face to the car window. That's the diner Mama worked at, she exclaimed, pointing at a faded sign barely hanging above the door. And that's the store where Mr. Jenkins gave us apples when we couldn't pay. Jonathan listened, each word striking deeper than any market report ever had. When the car stopped near the small apartment building they once called home, Margaret's shoulders hunched. The paint peeled from the siding. Children played barefoot in the gravel lot, their laughter echoing against cracked walls. Jonathan stepped out slowly, his shoes crunching on broken stone. He had walked through boardrooms worth billions, but never had he felt the weight of human struggle so acutely. Clara tugged his sleeve. See that porch? That's where the farmer left turnips for us in the winter. Her voice carried pride, not shame. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. This was the soil that had raised her, scarce, yet fertile with kindness. He turned to Margaret. You carried so much alone. Margaret's eyes glistened. We survived. But Clara deserved more. Jonathan looked at the children running across the lot, then at Clara's hopeful face. In that moment, he knew Hale Group's future could not only be about balance sheets and shareholders. It had to be about legacy, something that reached into places like this. We're going to change things, he said quietly. Not just for this family, For families like these. Back in New York, Jonathan called a press conference in the marble atrium of Hale Tower. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the podium, Clara standing proudly beside him. "For months," he began, "the world has watched my downfall and my return. But this story was never just mine. It belongs also to a little girl who reminded me what it means to live. Without Clara Ashford, I would still be lost in the dark." Gasps swept through the room. Jonathan placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, his voice steady. "From this day forward, she is no longer only the housekeeper's daughter. She is my daughter, my family. And together we will honor the lives that were taken by building something new." He unveiled the plan, the Hale Foundation, dedicated to supporting children in need, single mothers and small farmers across America. Its first project would be in West Virginia, where Margaret and Clara had once struggled. Scholarships, food programs, and microloans for local growers, the foundation would not just give, but empower. Reporters fired questions, but Jonathan answered each with a calm passion that silenced skepticism. For once, the cameras captured not a broken man, not a ruthless CEO, but a father reborn. That night, back at the mansion, Eleanor embraced her son. "You've not only returned, Jonathan, you've risen higher than before." Jonathan's gaze rested on Clara, who was chasing her kitten across the rug. "I've been given a second chance," he said softly, "and I won't waste it." Clara looked up, her laughter ringing like music. She skipped over and slipped her hand into his. "Does this mean you'll really be my dad now?" Jonathan knelt, his eyes misted but steady. "Yes, Clara. From this day forward, I will be your father. Not just in this house. Everywhere." Her smile lit the room brighter than the fire itself. She threw her arms around his neck. "Then this is the happiest day of my life." Jonathan closed his eyes, holding her close. For years, he had thought fatherhood ended with Sophie's last breath. But here, in the warmth of a little girl's embrace, he felt its rebirth. And for the first time, he believed his life was not only mended, it was made new. Autumn deepened in New York, painting Central Park with copper and gold. The city bustled as it always had, taxis blaring, crowds rushing, skyscrapers glowing into the dusk. But for Jonathan Hale, the rhythm of life had changed. Once, his calendar had been dictated by mergers, flights, and quarterly earnings. Now, he measured his days by smaller things: the laughter of a child, the warmth of family suppers, the quiet satisfaction of doing something good for someone who might never know his name. The Hale Foundation had already begun its first initiatives. In West Virginia, the old food pantry Clara remembered now carried the name Sophie's Table, a program providing fresh produce from local farms to struggling families. Scholarships were established for children whose parents worked in the mines. For the first time, Jonathan's wealth was not only saving his company but seeding hope in places long forgotten. And in New York, the work had already started. On a crisp Saturday morning, Jonathan took Clara and Margaret downtown to Bowery Mission, where volunteers served meals to the homeless. Reporters had tried to follow, but Jonathan refused cameras. "This is not for headlines," he told them. "This is for us." Inside the mission hall, long tables stretched across the room, lined with men and women whose eyes carried the weight of hard winters. Volunteers moved quickly, ladling soup, handing out bread. Clara tugged Jonathan's sleeve. "Can I help?" Jonathan knelt so his eyes were level with hers. "Yes, but remember, what you give is not just food. It's dignity. Look at each person in the eye. Let them know they matter." Clara nodded solemnly, then took her place behind the counter beside Margaret. Together, they filled plates, passed cups of cocoa, and smiled at every stranger who came through. Clara giggled when a man thanked her by tipping an imaginary hat. Margaret pressed a sandwich gently into the hands of a woman clutching a toddler. Jonathan stood back for a moment, watching. His heart swelled. He had seen boardrooms erupt with applause, investors roar with approval, but nothing compared to the sight of his daughter, his Clara, handing bread to a man whose hands trembled with hunger, her small face alight with kindness. When the hall quieted and the last plates were served, Clara bounded over, her apron stained with soup. "Did I do good?" she asked. Jonathan cupped her face, his eyes misted. "You did more than good. You lit a fire in here." He pressed a hand to his chest. That evening, the Hale mansion glowed with a different kind of light. For months, its corridors had echoed with silence. Now, laughter and warmth wove through its rooms. The scent of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. Eleanor arranged candles on the dining table. Margaret hummed as she carried in dishes. Clara chased her kitten through the hall, her giggles bouncing like music off the walls. After supper, they gathered in the great room. Jonathan lit the hearth himself, striking the match and holding it steady until the flame caught, dancing against the logs. The fire crackled, casting golden light across their faces. Clara curled on the rug, the kitten in her lap. Margaret settled in the armchair with her knitting. Eleanor, her silver hair gleaming in the glow, watched her son with quiet pride. Jonathan stood for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he spoke, his voice low but strong. "This house was once a tomb. I thought its fire had gone out forever. But tonight, I see I was wrong. The fire never died. It was waiting. For us." Clara looked up, her eyes wide. "Because of me?" Jonathan smiled gently. "Because of you. You reminded me that family is not lost, it is found. And from this day forward, you are not the maid's daughter. You are my daughter, my family." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. She set the kitten down and rushed into his arms. "This is my home," she whispered. Jonathan held her tight, his own tears falling freely. "Yes, Clara. And from now on, the fire will never go out again." Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling hands, her heart overflowing. Margaret's vision blurred as she watched the man she once served rise not just as a leader, but as a father reborn. Later, Jonathan guided Clara to the piano. The old instrument, once covered in dust, now gleamed in the firelight. "Shall we play?" he asked. Clara giggled. "Only if you promise not to stop when you hit the wrong note." "I promise," Jonathan said. Together they began the lullaby. But this time it was not haunting. It was not a ghost's cry. It was a song reborn, played in harmony, her high notes bright and sure, his deeper ones steady and strong. The melody filled the room, weaving through every shadow until none remained. When the final chord faded, silence fell. But it was not the silence of grief, so it was the silence of peace. Jonathan closed the piano lid and turned to the hearth. The flames crackled, warm and steady. Clara nestled against his side, her eyelids heavy. "Papa?" she whispered, the word shy, tentative. Jonathan's breath caught. He bent and kissed her hair. "Yes, Clara. I love you." Jonathan closed his eyes, holding her close. "And I love you, my daughter. Always." The fire blazed brighter, as though answering. For the first time since the night of the accident, Jonathan Hale did not feel haunted. He felt healed. The shadows were gone. In their place was a flame that promised to burn forever. A flame of love, of family, of hope. And in that quiet, golden glow, they found what had been missing all along. Home. Thank you for staying with us until the final page of Jonathan and Clara's journey. If stories of love, healing, and second chances touch your heart, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe and join us for the next one.